We got a guy from Harvard here tonight, a real smart guy. He's got a lot of publications. Now, I can either let him start speaking or I can read his list of accomplishments. So let's welcome Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson to tell us about replacing Darwin.
So I'm titling this Replacing Darwin, the New Origin of Species, to tell you something about my book, but instead of telling you all about what's in the book, I want to tell you about something that's happened since the book came out that I think gives the relevance of the entire message. But before I do, I want to dedicate this talk to a dear friend who passed away recently, Pastor Bob Ramey. He was the gentleman through whom I got connected with Midwest Creation Fellowship, probably about 2012. And one of his, at Woodside Bible Chapel, one of his Bible science rallies, I was the speaker. We developed a friendship after that. My wife was able to come out. And anyway, we just had, I don't think I spoke at his church since then, but we kept an email contact, and he was just a sweet brother in the Lord, and miss him dearly. But I think he'd be very pleased with what I have to tell you this evening. I want to tell you 4 stories briefly to set up the last story, the discovery that happened within the last half year since the book came out. So the book came out in October of last year. There's a discovery that was published January of this year that I think illustrates the relevance of what I've just done and the relevance of what creationists have done for many years, much better than just telling you about the book. But before I do, just briefly why this issue matters. So if you're a Bible-believing Christian and you care about the book of Genesis, surely you know that the idea of evolution is a direct attack on what the scriptures teach, what Darwin proposed, that all of life goes back to a common ancestor. All of life is on one gigantic genealogically related family tree, that we are related not just to the chimpanzees as a close relative, but to the snakes and lizards and scorpions and spiders and insects and everything else that roams this planet. Ultimately, we're relatives. That's what Darwin teaches. Very different from what the scriptures teach, which Genesis 1 says, day 5, God creates the creatures of the air, the creatures of the sea. Simultaneously, he does not derive them over millions of years from a common ancestor. The next day, he creates the land animals. Simultaneously, doesn't derive them from a series of common ancestors. The order of creation in Genesis is different from the order of appearance in the fossil record. It's difficult to harmonize the two records, so the mechanism of creation is different. The order of creation is different. The time of creation is different. They're just multiple points of contradiction. So evolution is a direct attack on the book of Genesis. And Genesis, of course, is the foundation for the gospel. So this is a critical issue for every believer. I think it's a critical issue for unbelievers for no other reason than this. So I've put 2 prominent evolutionists on the screen, Darwin from 150 years ago, and a contemporary evolutionist, Jerry Coyne, local, University of Chicago, now retired. Both of them have dealt over the years with a caricature of creation. If you read what Darwin wrote against in 1859, if you read what Jerry Coyne wrote against in 2009, the 150th anniversary of Darwin's work. So Coyne wrote a book, Why Evolution is True. Both of them are trying to refute an idea about creation that doesn't actually match what the Bible teaches. And what I've put in my book, and actually what creationists have been saying for decades, is very different from that. And so if you're an unbeliever, if you're a non-creationist, what I have to tell you is something that challenges and resets the debate, given what the proponents of evolution have been doing for 150 years. So there's the relevance. Now, to give you the relevance of the book I've just written, again, I want to tell you 4 stories just briefly to set up the 5th, which I think is a real bombshell and illustrates why this book matters. First story begins across the pond in Great Britain. Charles Lyell, Scottish geologist, is studying the Earth's surface, mapping out how the layers fit together or don't fit together, how they came to be, trying to overturn the science of Moses is his purpose. And publishes the 2 or 3 volume set, Principles of Geology. First volume comes out in 1830, and a young man who grew up a creationist picks up a copy of this book and doesn't stay a creationist. Charles Darwin grew up studying to be a clergyman and changed his mind partway through school. In 1831, set sail with a copy of Lyell's book on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, to take a year-long voyage around the globe. That turned into a 5-year-long voyage, hitting South America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, lots of different spots. For our purposes, I want to focus on his stop in the Galapagos. So as the resident naturalist, Darwin's job is to disembark and get samples of the plants and animals that they find at these various locations. The Galapagos are no exception. And on these islands, Darwin encounters a set of ordinary-looking birds. Ordinary-looking don't really capture your eye the way tropical birds do. Nonetheless, they are different enough from the birds that Darwin knows that he doesn't know how to identify them. So he captures them, collects them, keeps them in the hold, takes them back to England, where someone, a trained ornithologist, professional bird identifier, can analyze them. And so in 1837, John Gould, the ornithologist, looks at Darwin's birds and says these are unknown to science. We should call these, declare these different or new species. Hence Darwin's finches are born. And to give you a sense for the impact that this voyage had on Darwin himself, if you look at his notebooks, sort of his diaries, his journals, where he's collecting his thoughts and developing his ideas, you see this diagram, the now famous I think diagram, where you see just abstract species A, B, C, D, connected here in a common family tree. Some of the first hints Darwin is beginning to leave his creationist upbringing and moving towards an evolutionary thinking. The birds themselves that he discovered, that bear his name, are instrumental in his thinking. So this diagram, if you followed the creation-evolution debate, you've probably seen this. Answers in Genesis features it frequently on our website. This is actually from the second edition, 1845 edition of Darwin's book, The Voyage of the Beagle, where he describes some of the discoveries that he made and the trip that he took. And he says this, in that book, he says this about the finches. Again, more insights into the shift in his thinking. He says about the finches, the most curious fact is the perfect gradation in the size of the beaks in the different species. There are about 13 known then. You can see just 4 shown here, but even in this sample of 4, this guy's a longer, skinnier beak. Up there in the corner, that guy's got a bigger, stouter, thicker beak. There's a gradation. And he says, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this Galapagos archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. So Darwin says, just the fact that you can create a smooth transition. And we're not talking fossil transitional forms, living birds. You go from long and skinny to short and stout. The fact that you can see this gradation itself implies they come from a common ancestor. Darwin says this lends itself to invoking some sort of evolutionary process, that perhaps some bird flew over from the South American mainland to the Galapagos, then diversified by natural selection, survival of the fittest, into the species we see today. He applies that thinking to virtually all of life in 1859 when he writes his book on the origin of species. I say virtually all because he leaves the human origins question open. At least he does for about 12 years. 1871, he publishes The Descent of Man and applies his thinking to all of life. And just to show you that his thinking is firmly grounded in the Lyellian framework that he grew up with when he took Lyell's book with him on the Voyage of the Beagle. He says in the last edition that he published before he died, Darwin said this, I believe that natural selection, so the primary means by which species are supposed to evolve over millions of years, he believes that natural selection will generally act very slowly, only at long intervals of time. I further believe that these slow, intermittent results accord well with what geology tells us about the rate and manner at which the inhabitants of the world have changed. So evolution, you must understand, is a biological concept framed in a pre-existing geologic framework. 10 years later, Darwin is dead, but obviously his ideas long outlive him. So do the finches that bear his name. So here's a more recent image of these species. And again, you can see that gradation and diversity in structure in this particular image. So their importance to evolutionary biology goes quiet for about 90 years after Darwin's death, and resurrects its importance is resurrected with the arrival of Peter and Rosemary Grant, a British couple based in Princeton, New Jersey, at Princeton University. They go back to the Galapagos Islands and resume the study of these finches in hopes of discovering something about evolution. And if you're familiar with their work, you know that some of the more famous work is focused on one tiny island you can't even really see in this map. This is the Galapagos archipelago. The island Daphne Major is the site of one of the more famous studies. They've been looking at the medium ground finch, aptly named because it's not the biggest beak, it's not the smallest beak, it's the medium ground finch. Even in this static image, though, is somewhat deceptive. You'd think they all have identical beak sizes. They don't. There is, even within one species, variety in the size and shape of the beak. So you can see even this particular individual, this is a slightly skinnier beak than this individual. And less than a millimeter difference in beak size is enough to change the the diet. So these guys are forced to subsist on the easier to crack seeds because of the shape of their beak. This guy, because of its slightly larger, less than a millimeter thickness, bigger beak size, can crack some of these tougher to crack seeds. And this is evolutionarily significant because in the 4+ decades that the Grants have been watching these finches and watching them change, there have been, not surprisingly, weather changes, climate changes in the Galapagos Islands. There have been years of drought. There have been years of heavy rainfall, for example, El Niños, that right there in the Pacific. And the dominoes that fall in such a climactic change are as follows. So drought is obviously lack of rainfall. Plants need rain. Some plants can tolerate drought better than others. It just so happens that these types of plants can tolerate drought better than others. So rain is gone. These plants go bye-bye, these survive, and not surprisingly then these types of finches with the smaller, skinnier beaks die off, their food source dies off, these guys selectively survive to reproduce. And so over time, the average beak size measured here goes up with drought. And there are these cycles going up and down and back and forth. Natural selection in action. So this is now textbook evidence for evolution. If you've ever engaged people on the street or your neighbors or someone who holds evolution, you've probably encountered this example. You go to evolutionary websites, they say, this isn't even controversial anymore. It's observable fact in front of us. Why are we arguing about evolution? It's made famous additionally by this book, The Beak of the Finch, subtitled A Story of Evolution in Our Time. So again, you can see where they're going with this. It published in 94, won the Pulitzer Prize in 95. The Grants themselves have won many awards, not the least of which in this image is shown them as recipients of the Kyoto Prize in 2009. That's sort of the Japanese version of the Nobel Prize, so they've apparently won everything but the Nobel Prize for this. They were the only recipients in the basic sciences category in 2009 of the Kyoto Prize. So this is Exhibit A for evolution. Open up a textbook, you'll find it. This is the evidence for evolution, is what the evolutionists tell us. That's the first story. Darwin's finches are a big deal today for evolution. Second story deals with how the Grants do science, how medical researchers do science, what we take for granted as science. All that really has a recent origin. I was somewhat shocked to discover this. The old way of doing science goes back to the Greeks and Aristotle, and that lasted for almost 2,000 years, all the way up to the time of the Renaissance and Descartes. And if you can believe this, science was done not by laboratory experiments, not by going out into the field and banding birds and measuring their beak size. Science was done by thinking. Just by thinking. Deductive reasoning is a technical term. It goes like this, just to use a simple example. You'd start with a premise. In this case, a very simple premise might be all mammals are animals. Straightforward. If we want to know something about zebras, we might add another sentence after this. Zebras are mammals, and using the process of logic and deductive reasoning, we can deduce that zebras therefore are animals. So what? What I've just done here is a formal logical proof. And because it's a proof, why would you do any experiments? There's no ambiguity, there's no uncertainty. It's a very powerful way to discover things about the world, thinking. Let's use another example. All animals must camouflage their appearance. Seems fairly straightforward. Survival of the fittest. You don't blend in, you're going to die. Someone's going to pick you off. Applying that to zebras, their appearance is obvious. Children recognize zebras by their stripes, black and white stripes. So it seemed, therefore, black and white stripes serve as camouflage for zebras. Well, what would Aristotle do if I showed him this particular example? Are the feathers of this male peacock helping it blend into the bushes? Or are the feathers of this male peacock serving the opposite function to help him stand out from the bushes so some peahen will come along and notice him and be his mate? Obviously the latter. So the problem with this particular example is the premise is wrong. What would the Greeks have done? The Greeks may have just said, oh, that's a monster, some weird example that we don't know what to do with, we'll just ignore it for the time being. And of course, the problem with this thinking is you can maybe do that once or twice. The weird, unexplained exceptions, we'll just ignore them, but the more you look, the more exceptions you find. In Wisconsin, Illinois, we've got red cardinals that fly up here throughout the winter, and they stand out like a sore thumb against the white snow. It's not camouflage. And you go through the tropics. There's how many tropical birds that stand out and are ornately colored for the purpose of attracting a mate. So this premise has serious trouble, and so if the premise is in trouble, so is the conclusion. at least by this process of thinking. You can't prove that conclusion if the premise is an error. And consistent with this little example, if you look at the scientific literature today, there is no agreement on what purpose the stripes actually serve. To our eyes, we think it's camouflage, but this black and white alternating pattern could also serve a function of regulating body temperature. So black absorbs light, white reflects it. This might create a temperature gradient that allows it to survive the hot African savanna and the hot African sun. It could function in social grouping, could function in defense against biting flies. The point is, science by thinking is completely dependent upon the existence of premises that we can use to deduce conclusions. And this is both the great strength and the Achilles heel of the method, because think about contemporary scientific questions like cancer or colon cancer specifically. What premise do we know of that would allow us to deduce a cure? So working backwards in this method of science by thinking, we all know what we want the conclusion to be, the therefore statement to be. We all want therefore something cures cancer. Some exercise, some treatment, something. We almost don't care what it is, so long as it works. And the sentence before that would be whatever body part cancer occurs in. If you're interested in breast cancer, colon cancer, you fill in the blank right here. I'm just picking colon cancer. But to reason our way to a conclusion by thinking, we have to know a premise that allow us to deduce this. And I know of none that would allow us to deduce a cure for cancer. And if you know of some, talk to me afterwards. There are plenty of people who'd like to know the answer. But I have a hunch no one really has a good premise. So if all you have for doing science is thinking, you're stuck. And there's a whole bunch of outstanding, in particular, medical questions that we're stuck on and can't do anything about. Fortunately, that's not where the scientific method ended. The modern scientific method, science by experimentation, goes to Francis Bacon. So it has a recent origin. He gives us the inductive method of reasoning, or the process of the scientific method, science by experimentation. And it starts very simply just with observations. Instead of a premise, you start with just, you go outside, you look around, what you see, and you write it down. So if you're looking at zebras, the most obvious fact that hits you is they're black and white. They have black and white stripes and 4 legs. And you just keep observing. That's the method. You just keep observing until you see a general pattern. And if at some point you see a general pattern, you can stop and say, I wonder if this is always true. You can infer a general rule. Perhaps all zebras have black and white stripes and 4 legs. All zebras probably have black and white stripes and 4 legs. So notice here, this is not a proof statement. It's a probability statement. And because it's a probability statement, you have to do an experiment to know how frequently this is true, if this is ever true, if you've misinterpreted this. This is why experiments are so important in the modern method. We don't speak about proof anymore because we're not using this science by thinking, we're doing science by experimentation. And so the way you might test this hypothesis is to go back to Africa, go to the field, and see if you can find any exceptions. And if you do, you might count how frequently these exceptions occur. In this particular herd, looks like they all have black and white stripes and 4 legs, no exceptions. But if you looked long enough on the African savanna, you might find some odd exceptions. So this individual lacks this striping pattern. And unlike the Greek era and the Renaissance era, where you might just dismiss this as a weird monster, you don't know what to do with it, in the era of experimentation, exceptions are some of the most helpful tools to discovering the real answer. So why does this particular individual lack black and white stripes? What you might do at this stage is come up with a hypothesis. You might say, well, I wonder if in this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, if they all have the genetic program for stripes, but it's gone awry in that gentleman over there on the left. Or maybe they all have the intact genetic program for stripes, but something happened during development that made this program go awry. These are all things we can test. You can get a tissue sample, a blood sample from each of these guys, send them off to the lab, get the DNA sequence, look for the genetic part encoding stripes, and see if there's a change. The exception may prove the rule. Exceptions are very helpful tools. That's just one illustration of the process of science by experimentation. Here's how we're going to find the answer to cancer, hopefully, by this process of experimentation. And the way you start then is by making observations. You might get some colon cancer samples and get their DNA. sequence it, compare it to normal tissue. So if you're a surgeon, you're cutting out a tumor, you might cut out the tumor, then you cut out a little piece of normal tissue next to it, put them both in a petri dish, extract the genetic material, send it off to be sequenced, compare the two. Is there something different in cancer? And this is a result, an experimental result that's been observed many, many, many times and is continuing to be observed. It seems like there's some major DNA sequencing papers that come out fairly regularly now in the major journals. So much so that we could infer a general rule. Perhaps all cancers are caused by specific DNA mutations, which implies that maybe we can cure cancers by targeting these specific mutations. Again, this is a tentative statement of probability, not of proof, so you can't talk about proof, you can just talk about experiments. And let me give you one rare example of success on this question using this method. So if I had a volunteer come up after we're done here, and I would wipe your skin with alcohol, stick you with a needle, take out a blood sample, take a drop, put it on the slide, put that slide under a microscope. Your blood might look, your smear might look something like this: a whole bunch of disc-shaped red cells that carry oxygen with a smattering of white cells throughout. The exact number of white cells will have a relationship with whether or not you've recently been infected, but there's going to be an excess of red cells as a general rule. If you have a leukemia, an overproliferation of white cells, and we did that, wiped you down, poked you with a needle, take a blood sample, put it under a microscope, you'd see a whole lot more white cells. And eventually, if those keep proliferating, keep dividing, it could kill you, probably suffocate you. Well, in one particular type of leukemia, chronic myelogenous leukemia, there's been a particular type of DNA change that's occurred. The details here don't really matter, so don't worry about the chromosomes. The point is, in cancers, you get a particular molecule that occurs because of a DNA change. The BCR-ABL mutation leads to a specific molecule in the abnormal white cells that you don't find in the normal white cells. So some of the pharmaceutical companies have tried to come up with a particular drug that targets this weird molecule. Gleevec is that molecule, that drug that targets it, and we've seen a tremendous degree of success in this particular case. Sadly, most cancers do not have this molecule as a weird mutation, and so Gleevec doesn't work for most of the cancers. But here's just, again, a rare example of science by thinking. Science by experimentation, in contrast to science by thinking. That's almost the entire story. There's one last example, there's one last element of this method that shows up in a very big way in the origins debate, and this last piece, the bookend to the method of science by experimentation, goes back to a man who lived after Darwin died, Karl Popper. He lived in the 1900s. He gave us the idea of falsification. So this is the last step of the modern scientific method. So it's still observation, 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 infer a general rule, then you go test it. But what Popper gave us is this last testing step, falsification. His falsificationist methodology holds that scientific theories are characterized by entailing predictions that future observations might reveal to be false. It's very counterintuitive, seemingly backwards. So if you observe, you infer a general rule, then you do an experiment. The goal of your experiment is not to prove that your idea is true. The goal of your experiment is to try to disprove your idea. That's the backwards part. And if you try to disprove your idea, but it survives, and then you do another experiment, and you try to disprove it again, and it survives, and you do this over and over and over again, and your idea is still surviving, still standing, then your confidence that it's actually true, that confidence grows. That's the modern method. So it's different from science by thinking, where you talk about proof. Science by experimentation, you primarily talk about disproof. We talk about theories and laws. Those are ideas that have survived many, many, many attempts, years of attempts to disprove them. And this will show up again in a big way momentarily. Science is a method of disproof. That's a second story, the story of the history of science. Now, very briefly, I want to give you a fast-forward overview of the origins debate, and I'm going to start this origins debate with Linnaeus. Why? Charles Darwin writes a book, The Origin of Species. We can't have a debate over the origin of species until we actually know what a species is. In other words, if we're debating the origin of elephants, and I'm talking about a particular explanation for the origin of the elephant species, and I'm communicating with someone in China, we've got to be talking about the same thing. And if I'm communicating with someone in Africa, we've got to be talking about the same thing. So Linnaeus gives us this method for classifying life in a manner that everyone around the globe can talk about it in a consistent way. The genus species, Loxodonta africanus, may have butchered the name, but that's one of the, I think, the African elephant species. Homo sapiens is the technical Linnaean term for humans. So Linnaeus gives us that term in the 1700s. That's when the debate can begin for the first time. And it wasn't that Darwin came along after 100 years, so 1859 is when Darwin comes along. He doesn't come along after 100 years and finally solves this long-standing mystery. No, for 100 years there was a very strong explanation for where species came from that Linnaeus himself held to early in his career, and it comes from just very basic observation. So if you look at this screen, what's the first thing that strikes you about this Arctic fox species? Stark white. So this was known to Linnaeus. He was a Swedish biologist, so he's close to the Arctic. White fur, thick fur, blends into our eyes with the stark Arctic environment. So it seems that the parts of this fox are matched to the parts of the environment. And William Paley, a contemporary of Linnaeus, points out that when parts are matched for a purpose, and he gives the watchmaker analogy. So if you find a watch lying on the ground, if you were to open it up, you'd see the parts matched for the purpose of telling time. That's the smoking gun of design. So you see parts of the creature matched to the parts of the environment, smoking gun of design. That's the thinking in the 1700s, all the way up to 1859. If you go elsewhere in the globe and look for foxes, you'll find different ones, like this red fox exists native to Europe and Asia. How many red foxes do you see in the screen? So some have said there's two, so you see one right here and you see one right there. There's actually one hiding in the bushes right there. So 2 is the correct answer, but maybe not for the reasons you might first think. But once again, the parts of the fox, its multicolored coat, seem to match the multicolored, more temperate environment in which it naturally exists. And this is just one example of many, many examples we could cite where the parts of the creatures are matched to the parts of the environment. This leads to 2 compelling inferences. Since the parts of the Arctic fox are matched for the Arctic, the parts of the red fox match for the temperate environment of Europe and Asia, it would seem that they were designed for these environments. Natural, logical inference. It's the inference that Darwin tries to rebut in 1859. And he challenges the consensus. You look at the closing chapter of his work, he knows that people are going to object to him and say, well, sure, Darwin, all sounds great and fine, but no one agrees with you, so why should we believe you? Sound familiar? It's a common tactic in today's debates, typically by those opposed to me, and it's self-refuting, because if consensus determines truth, then evolution is dead on arrival in 1859. The publication of this book is met with swift and severe reaction. One of the more famous ones takes place about half a year later in Oxford. I was just doing a tour in England. I got to be at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History where this debate took place. You have a monument there outside the museum commemorating this event. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, there on the left, was present, as was a young Thomas Huxley, shown there on the right. Huxley was later known as Darwin's bulldog for his tenacious defense of Darwin's ideas. And because you have a clergyman against a naturalist, this idea of religion versus science gained a great foothold. So Darwin's work was being discussed at the museum that day. Wilberforce got up and excoriated Darwin's ideas. Huxley got up and excoriated Wilberforce. And the sources that you consult vary on what actually happened. Wilberforce wrote up a formal, anonymous review of Darwin's work that was all science. So even though he was a clergyman, he was explicit in this write-up saying, look, I've just made scientific objections to what Darwin said. This has nothing to do with religion. And Wilberforce, one of the things he pointed out was about Darwin's work, he said, when subjected to the stern Baconian law of the observation of facts, the theory breaks down utterly. Baconian, what do you mean Baconian? Adjective form of a name, Francis Bacon. His point was, Wilberforce's point was, if you look at what Darwin wrote, and if we're going to judge it by, not science by thinking, but science by experimentation, what we should see is observation, inference, testing. Where is it? And then he has some quotes from Darwin where Darwin says, well, I can conceive, and is it not unreasonable? Is it not reasonable? That sort of thing. He said, that's just speculation, that's not science. Very interesting. So the nature of science and how we do science, it was being developed and gaining ground even in the 1800s. That idea would come back to, at least initially, try to hurt Darwin. Notice what Huxley said in response. So one of the newspaper reports the next day of this exchange, the oral exchange, said this: Huxley defended Mr. Darwin's theory from the charge of it merely being a hypothesis, just speculation instead of science. Huxley said it was an explanation of phenomena and natural history. Without asserting that every part of the theory had been confirmed, he maintained it was the best explanation of the origin of species which had yet been offered. That's a key phrase that has lasted to this day, still used by evolutionists today. And here's why it's so clever. You can debate whether or not there's inductive reasoning with respect to evolution in Darwin's work. What is, I think, uncontroversial is the fact that inductive reasoning does exist in his book with respect to this idea. In fact, he almost anticipates Karl Popper. What Darwin does extensively is try to disprove this. And so here's why you get this idea of the best explanation. So if Darwin comes along and there's this idea that all species were created in their current location, he comes along and then proposes a different idea and disproves this one, well then, last man standing. Best explanation. Clever idea and very successful. So just to put this on a timeline then, so from 1758, Paley, Linnaeus up to Darwin, the fixity of species rules. Within 10 years, Darwin overturns that idea and sways the consensus to his side. By the way, there was a journal article from the 80s, the British Journal of the History of Science, discussing that Wilberforce-Huxley exchange that so many people call an example of religion versus science. And this is a secular journal. And it was very interesting to read that they said, actually, there was probably something else at play. So you may have noticed in this particular slide, Wilberforce looks significantly older than Huxley. And this article said that probably the more powerful dynamic at play in this particular exchange was not religion versus science, but an older generation versus a younger one. The older generation was independently wealthy, did science sort of voluntarily. The younger generation was science as a career. And that dynamic explains what happened that day. And Darwin, if you read again the closing chapter of his book, explicitly appeals to the younger generation. And to paraphrase him, and I can't believe he got away with this in Victorian England, he basically said, there's some old dogs who aren't going to learn new tricks. I'm not going to try to persuade them. He said, but I look, and this is almost a direct quote, he says, I look with confidence to the young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. And within 10 years, they won the day. And that's been the rule, the consensus ever since in the professional scientific community. Obviously, at the lay level, there's been severe dispute, perhaps famously at the Scopes trial, 1925. Here we had a Tennessee law in the books that forbade the teaching of certain aspects of evolution. Some adventurous lawyers came along and said, let's try to challenge it. So they got John Scopes to supposedly violate the law. They put him on trial, became a national scene. Clarence Darrow called William Jennings Bryan to the stand to try to defend creation. Bryan famously did a horrible job defending creation. Darrow made him look like a fool. And then when he concluded grilling Bryan, he turned to the judge, Darrow, the judge for the Scopes who violated the law. Darrow turns to the judge and says, please convict my client. Now, why would he do that if his job is to try to defend the guy and not make him out to be a lawbreaker? Well, the explanation is several. Number one, he didn't want to have Bryan get a chance to stand up and defend himself. Number two, he knew Bryan was going to make Darrow take the stand and try to do the same treatment to him, make him defend evolution, make evolution look foolish. And so to avoid all that, he just says, convict my client. And so there were actually two major consequences from this trial. One is the lasting stereotype of creationists as dumb, bumbling fools who don't know what they're talking about. The other effect, lesser known effect, is that it actually had a chilling effect on the teaching of evolution. The evolutionists say this. Because the outcome of the trial was conviction. Who wanted to be a lawbreaker, so they avoided teaching it. That only lasted a few decades. 1959, this is actually quite apropos here. 1959 was the centennial celebration of Darwin's book, and the gigantic celebration happened in Chicago. And this injected new life into the study of evolution, research in evolution, and the teaching of evolution. Sort of a reawakening. Ironically, 2 years later, A PhD hydrologist named Henry Morris at Virginia Tech, chair of the engineering department, publishes a book in collaboration with John Whitcomb, a theologian from Princeton, who did training at Princeton, the book The Genesis Flood, which pretty much everyone on all sides of the aisle agrees is the point at which the modern young earth creationist resurgence begins. I want to focus very briefly here on some of the immediate aftermath of that book. So it was received enthusiastically in the Christian community. Some of you might remember that. I was born in 80, so I'm told that before that time, there really were no good scientific creationist answers. People say, yes, I believe the Bible is true, but I don't know what to do with the science. I just believe it. Morris comes along and finally gives a coherent explanation that synthesizes all of this and captures not just the lay Christian community's attention, but the professional Christian community, so much so that you have the Creation Research Society founded in 1963. I think you have to have at least a master's degree, so there's professional scientists who are catching the vision, who are reading this book and saying, yeah, I agree with you. It was founded for the purpose of publishing research because they were, not surprisingly, having trouble getting their ideas published in the mainstream journals. Also, not surprisingly, Morris's life at Virginia Tech becomes a little bit more difficult. So he takes a sabbatical in 1969, decides to leave Virginia Tech, and found the Institute for Creation Research in 1970. I was there for 6 years before coming to Answers in Genesis. Duane Gish, the PhD biochemist, joins him in the 1970s. They do about 100 debates, many on university campuses. Thousands of students in attendance. The student newspapers are writing this up in a positive way. The evolutionists look back on that era and admit they did a horrible job defending evolution. They were totally blindsided. A real wave of interest in creation is building in the 1970s. Why? What is so unique about Morris and Gish's strategy that catches the evolutionists off guard? Before I tell you what Morris said about his strategy, consider this. This is something I discovered recently. At the AIG library, we have a number of textbooks from the 1950s. I went to these textbooks expecting to document something that I'll tell you about more in a moment. In these old textbooks with respect to how evolutionists reacted to creationists, and I couldn't do it because you really don't see anything in the way of evolutionists reacting to creationists, because apparently 1950s, pre-1961, there was no organized creationist, no national organized creationist opposition, enough that the evolutionists thought it was worthy of taking note of and responding to. So they don't even mention it. You don't find it in the 1950s textbooks. So they're caught off guard by this wave of enthusiasm, and this is Morris and Gish's very successful strategy. And this sets the tone then for what's happened in the last 40 years. Very important. Morris had a four-part strategy. He said, we're always careful to stick strictly to scientific arguments, especially using, number one, the fossil record to show macroevolution has not occurred in the past. Absence of transitional forms. Number two, characteristics of mutation and natural selection show it's not occurring in the present. So mutation is largely degradative. Natural selection eliminates variation. There seems to be things going downward, not upward. That was point two. And of course, point number three, Morris was famous for this, showing the laws of thermodynamics, especially second law of thermodynamics, to show that evolution could not occur at all. So since the second law says everything is moving towards disorder, and evolution requires a long-term movement towards more and more order and complexity, this would seem to be in conflict. And then Gish, of course, famous for using the principles of probability to show that complex functioning systems could never arise by chance, especially with respect to the first life, the origin of life. So this all comes to a head in the 1980s. 1981, the National Center for Science Education is founded for the explicit purpose of opposing the teaching of creation science in public schools. So that was one of the other things that happened in the 1970s. Renewed interest in mandating the teaching of creation science in the public school systems. So the NCSC, Eugenie Scott, one of the more famous past presidents, Ann Reed, I think, is the current president. 1982 is a watershed year for a number of reasons. Federal court trial, the Arkansas court trial, Arkansas law in the books saying mandating the teaching of creation science. This gets overturned, challenged in court and overturned. And one of the reasons I say it's watershed year is if you look at, and I think one of our librarian, Walt Stumper, has maintained like a wiki page of this. If you look at the evolutionary publication record, pre-1982, you see very little in the way of anti-creationist literature. Post-1982, it's one book after another. So the 1970s generates a wave of enthusiasm, enough that the evolutionists finally take note. So today you have whole chapters dedicated to refuting creation science. Weird way to measure progress, but it's different from the 1950s, where they don't even pay attention, they don't even mention creation science. Now it's gained enough of a national following. The evolutionists know we've got to deal with this at the academic public level. So the last reason this is such a watershed moment is because of the standard evolutionists have held creationists to for the last 40 years. And I'll give you some examples of this, quotes from 82 up to the present day, that illustrate their new strategy. Now, this is the strategy I thought I'd be documenting in the 1950s, and of course couldn't because they weren't dealing with creation in the 1950s. So what is it the evolutionists have said the creationists need to do? And what I want you to see is that their strategy is a reaction to Morris and Gish, and a reaction to the Morris and Gish debate strategy. So let me take a quote here from a 1982 book by Niles Eldredge, the famous paleontologist, colleague of Stephen Jay Gould with Punctuated Equilibrium. So Eldredge wrote a book, The Monkey Business, in 1982. A scientist looks at creationism. This is what he says about creation. So he's familiar with Morris and Gish. He says, creation science isn't science at all, nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. Now I'm going to show you quotes from different people, and there's a common thread that I want you to see that goes back to the story I just told you, the second story. So no scientifically testable statements, he says. At least 95% of all their reams of privately published books and pamphlets are devoted to an attack on conventional science. So he recognizes that Morris and Gish say evolution can't happen here, 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 or here, and he says that's not good enough. Not good enough to say here's the problems. You've got to come up with a testable prediction. You look at the text of the court decision itself. The judge lists 5 characteristics of science, the last one being that science is falsifiable. And he says creation science fails to meet these essential characteristics. Not testable, not falsifiable, he says. Zooming ahead to the present, here's a third-year junior-level university textbook. So if you're studying biology, you're a biology major at the undergraduate level. Third year, you're probably going to take a course on evolution, a semester-long course on evolution, and would likely use this textbook by Douglas Fujiyama. He's got a whole chapter now dedicated to refuting creationist arguments. One of his points is that the most important feature of scientific hypotheses is that they are testable. And he says creation science is not testable. Do you see the common theme here? One more example. I've listened to 2 debates this year between evolutionists and in particular creationists. The first gentleman on the left here is Herman Mays from Marshall University. He's an evolutionary biologist, PhD. The gentleman on the right is Aaron Ra, famous atheist in the United States. Both of them made the same point to their creationist opponent. Give us a testable prediction. So what's the common theme? The theme is falsification. From Karl Popper, the man who postdates Darwin, but who dictates the modern terms of how we do science by experimentation. So what evolutionists have been saying for 40 years, what they've been demanding of creationists for 40 years, is hypotheses that can be disproven. And that goes back again to the history of science, to the history of how we know what we know about the natural world. Disproof, not proof. Now I'm going to extract in my 4th story here from that timeline a few more details about the history of modern creationism, because this is popularly misunderstood, especially by opponents of creation science, and mangled. So let's get the story straight. The modern creation science view goes back to the beginning of the debate itself, to Carl Linnaeus. He was the son of a Lutheran minister, so appropriate we're in this building. If you look at the Latin that he wrote, and you do like I do and use Google Translate to try to translate it, you'll see references to the Psalms, texts that you don't find in the books and the works of leading scientists today. So Linnaeus is the father of our modern classification system. How many leaders of scientific fields write stuff like that in their work? Our God is great, his power is great, his power is infinite. You don't see that. So early in his career, he did hold to the fixity of species, that God creates creatures in their current locations, that the red fox and the Arctic fox are not related, they were placed in those spots at creation, haven't migrated there since. Obviously, this is not biblical. You may have noticed that when I derived that view, there weren't any scriptural references. It's just based on simple observations. That's not where Linnaeus ended his career. He changed his view, and many people don't know this. He changed his view later in life because of hybrids. So he worked primarily with plants. And what he discovered later in life is that some plants that he calls separate species could interbreed. A more modern example, more familiar example would be the mule, which is a cross between the horse species and the donkey species, separate species that can interbreed, produce live offspring, albeit sterile. If you've been to Kentucky to the Creation Museum, you might have seen our Zorse and Zonkey, crosses between a horse and a zebra, donkey and a zebra. Those are all separate species that can produce live offspring. I think they're some of the prettiest creatures on the planet. So later in life, Linnaeus says this. This is a radical departure from where he started. Linnaeus stated that God created as many individuals as there were orders. So it goes species, the next level of classification is genus, then family, then order. So that's fairly broad. All mammal carnivores, foxes and walruses and wolves and cats and hyenas, all that carnivores, one order. So God creates orders, then God later mixes these to form genera. That's the plural of genus. Nature, in turn, mixed these genera to form species, and fate mixed these to make out varieties. And as a specific example, he proposed that dog, wolf, and fox, which are all separate species, well, dog and wolf, sometimes separate species, same species, depending on who you talk to. He said they're part of the same created genus and were products of hybridization. So let's think about this general rule that Linnaeus espoused. So today, not only are the Arctic fox and the red fox classified as separate species, they're placed each in its own genus. Linnaeus says that one genus can mix with another. Nature mixes the genera. So if you're trying to identify the created kind, that unit of creation that doesn't change into another unit of creation, it can't be species, it can't be genus, it must be the next level up. Family, I think, was sort of a later addition to the system. Linnaeus jumped from genus to order, but it has to be above genus. So what I'm trying to show you here is that from the beginning of this debate, this idea that the created kinds were approximately the level of families is present. This is not a recent invention, so the opponents of creation science accuse creationists of changing their view of species and of the origin of species to try to fit animals on board the ark, that originally they held to species being fixed and unchanging as the number of species known to science grew and grew and grew such that it would outstrip the size of the ark. Well, we had to change our view. Not true at all. It goes back to Linnaeus himself. Intellectual pedigree traces to him. Darwin was unaware that Linnaeus changed his view. When he wrote his book, he only learned later in life. Linnaeus' view is, of course, the view that Henry Morris picked up on, not even first in the Genesis flood. He had written a book earlier, 1946, when he was still on staff at Virginia Tech, I think. He had a number of students come to him and say, well, what do we do with science? We're Christians, how do we mesh the two? So he wrote a book for his students, That You Might Believe. And he said, even as early as 1946, it's well to observe at this point that the Bible does not teach the fixity of species. It's probable that the original Genesis kind is closely akin to what the modern systematist calls a family. And since Linnaeus' time, since Morris's book in 1946, we've got more and more and more examples of different species that can interbreed. This is a liger, cross between a tiger and a lion. Even Linnaeus' specific example, dog, wolf, and fox, that I just showed you here, concluding that as a general rule, the kind is the level of family, that rule has held true. As a general rule of thumb, this is a good approximation of what a kind is. The cat family, from lions, tigers, to house cats, all 37 or so species, same kind. So what's so radical about this proposal is, if the kind is the family, well, there's multiple species within the family. And Scripture says, Genesis 6 through 9, Genesis 6 and 7, God commands Noah to take 2 of every kind on board the ark, not of every species. So there were 2 representatives of this dog, wolf, coyote, fox family, and all the 30-plus species that exist in that family today, which I'm going to flip through here real fast. All of this variety must have arisen post-flood. The 300-plus dog breeds post-flood. So modern young earth creationists, old young earth creationists, like Linnaeus, all would have espoused this view. They were totally okay with the formation of new species. To use the zebra, horse, donkey example, there's 3 recognized living species of zebras that differ in the patterning of their stripes. There's genetic differences among them as well. The one living wild species of horse, the Przewalski's horse, which actually has sometimes bars, primitive stripes on its legs. Onager, the Kiang, the Asian wild asses, and the African wild ass. Those are the 7 living species in this family. The 850 plus breeds of horses and donkeys, all part of the same family. All of that from a pair on board the ark. With birds, it gets even more wild. So breeding studies have demonstrated that not just these colorful birds and these colorful birds, but if you comprehensively look at the breeding, over 1,000 species of sparrows and finches belong to the same kind. They come from a common kind on board the ark. So that's a lot of speciation in a short amount of time. And just to generalize what I'm showing you here, so young Earth creationists, of course, would say, as a general rule, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds were the types of creatures born on board the Ark. There's a few hundred families within these categories, but there's over 30,000 species within mammals and reptiles and amphibians and birds. So that's tens of thousands of new species in a few thousand years. Flood about 4,500-ish years ago. Very different from the evolutionary view. And if you've been around this debate long enough, you've probably heard the evolutionists claim that young Earth creationists, when they understand what we actually believe, they think young Earth creationists are hyper-evolutionists, believing in way more speciation in such a compressed amount of time, very different from what evolutionists espouse. So this is different from what Darwin proposed in 1859, very different from what Darwin argued against, very different from what Jerry Coyne argues against. So where does that leave us? Let's look at a specific example. 11,000 living bird species today. Let's just assume, to keep the math simple, that these all formed from a few hundred bird families on board the Ark at a constant rate. Changing rates makes the math complicated, so we'll keep it simple. So 11,000 divided by 4,500 years gives you an average rate of 2.4 new bird species per year. Now, that could have been a burst of speciation immediately following the flood that's tapered off to the present, still averages out to 2.4 new bird species per year. And to show you how different this is from the evolutionary model. So they, of course, say birds evolved from dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, they say, went extinct 65 million years ago. You've got to give some time for those dinosaur ancestors to evolve through the transitional forms to the modern birds. If you look at the evolutionary literature, they'd say the modern birds, the 11,000 species, began speciating about 35 million years ago. So let's use that number. 35 million divided by 11,000 species gives you one new species every 3,200 years. That's around the time of King David. So they say one new species every King David, and nothing since. So in 3,200 years, at the rate I just told you, 2.4 gives you close to 8,000 new species. So there's orders of magnitude difference, which shouldn't be surprising because the timescales, 35 million versus 4,500, are also orders of magnitude different. But there's something vital that I don't want you to miss here. This number is a testable, falsifiable prediction. That's something you can go out into the field and test. Something, the type of calculation I put in print last fall. So this is a huge advance in the debate. They can't use that objection anymore. 40-year-old objection. Give us something testable, falsifiable. I was at the NEA convention, National Educators Association, no bastion of conservatism, just last week, and that came up there. It's not science, it doesn't have testable predictions. We were giving away that book because it's such a liberal place. But very difficult because people can buy the booth and say, you couldn't pay me to take your book. So there's great stereotypes that have to be overcome. But the point is, they were raising those objections, and those objections no longer hold. So now the story that I've wanted to tell you that I think gives the relevance of this book in a way I never would have anticipated. Back to Darwin's finches. Let's tie all four of these stories together. In 1981, a male of the large cactus finch, and I'll have a bigger image of each of these species here in a moment, a male of the large cactus finch migrated over to Daphne Major, the island that Grants have been studying for 4 decades, mated with several medium ground finch females. This is a family tree. The circles are females, the squares are males. You can see F0 represents the parental generation. F1 is the first offspring, first filial. But the offspring generation, then they have offspring, so forth. And the bars connect, the horizontal lines connect mating. So this guy mates with a bunch of females. Most of those offspring just get absorbed into the medium ground finch population. But by generation 3, in this particular mating, you can see there's a close relative mating. And here, their offspring become reproductively isolated. So they're building nests on the same island as that medium ground finch, but they're not intermating. Part of it has to do with the mating call that's learned through the father. And anyway, details don't really matter here. The point is, these guys have become reproductively isolated. They're not mating with other species. These guys have a different beak size than either that parent, or parental species. And I'll show you that in a minute. And because the Grants are very thorough researchers and have been taking tissue samples from every single individual that they banned, they can now look at these blood samples, get the DNA, and these guys are genetically distinct. So basically everything that defines a new species, reproductive isolation, morphological differences, genetic differences, has been observed since 1981. And so in 2018, January this year, in Science magazine, they announced rapid hybrid speciation in Darwin's finches. They were hesitant to give it a new species name because there's only about 35 individuals, but here's that big bird lineage. Here's the large cactus finch. You can see his beak size, the male that flew over. This is the male of the medium ground finch, Geospiza fortis. And this guy has a beak size that's bigger than that medium ground finch, and it's distinct. So, new species forms. By the way, 2015, the scientific community went back to the Galapagos Islands to say, are there any finch species we might have missed initially in the counting? And they did some comprehensive genetics of the birds, and they said, actually, we've missed about 4. So that the recognized total number of species before this study was up to 18. And of course, now they've observed this new species form. Well, what does that imply about the testable predictions put in print several months prior in my book? So 18 species of Darwin's finches recognized. First one's discovered, 1837, with John Gould, as a result of Darwin's voyage on the Beagle. That's 181 years ago. One new species in 181 years. So 1 divided by 100 is 0.01. 1 divided by 200 is 0.005. It's a lot less than 2.4. That would seem to be a refutation, but only at first pass, because 2.4 new bird species per year is a rate that represents a global rate. 2.4 new bird species per year means that somewhere in the world, a pelican or an osprey or an eagle or a finch or a goldfinch or a bird of paradise, something is going to form a new species. 2 to 3 species are going to form new ones. And Darwin's finches represent a small fraction of the total global bird population. So we have to apply a correction factor. 1 new species divided by 181 years, divided by 18 times 11,000 to compare it to the rate I published. So let's line these numbers up in a row. 1 new species for evolution, 1 new species every King David is 0.0003 new bird species per year, per 11,000 species globally. Creationist prediction is much higher, 2.4 new bird species per year. 1 divided by 181 divided by 18 times 11,000 gives you a rate of 3.4 new bird species per year. So that's analogous to saying the following. Let's say NFL football, political disputes notwithstanding, is still being played in 2050. And I say to you, I can predict for you in 2050 who's going to be playing in the Super Bowl, and I'm going to predict for you the final score. And lo and behold, NFL football survives to 2050, and the exact 2 teams that I predicted are playing, and I predict the final score, and I'm off by a field goal. You'd still say that was pretty good. That's what this number represents. It's even faster. In fact, this isn't even an entirely fair comparison. So these numbers implicitly incorporate the rates of extinction. These are long-term speciation rates. This is a short-term speciation rate. So this rate might actually decrease as this, it's only 35 individuals. They could go extinct. But I've got a whole article that discusses the nuances. But this is a really interesting initial study. I knew of no studies that did a comprehensive measurement of speciation like this. So in the icon of evolution, we've observed a rate of speciation almost exactly in line with what the young Earth biblical timescale predicts, and in severe conflict with what evolution predicts. Couldn't come in a more ironic example. So the bottom line is this idea is working. People complain and object and say, well, how can you have 30,000 new species form in just a few thousand years? How? As if this is a question of plausibility. How could it happen? Well, we don't even need to worry about that because we've already seen it happen. It's already been documented at rates we've expected. This is not working. So Darwin's finches, the exhibit A for evolution for 40 years, is confirming the falsifiable, testable predictions of the creation model. The rate of speciation in these finches is matching up almost exactly with what we've predicted. And it's in conflict. It's basically disproving the evolutionary model. So this is a big bombshell. That's what I think makes this book so relevant. Not only does it give us testable predictions, falsifiable predictions, and answers the 40-year objection, the reaction to Morris and Gish, and says, no, you can't do that anymore. It's making things that are working. So just to give you a brief overview, I wrote this book in a little different style than most of what we do at Answers in Genesis. So that as the name implies, our primary audience is someone who believes the Bible is true but doesn't know what to do with science. Yes, I believe the Bible is true. I believe Genesis, but what about cavemen? What about the dinosaurs? What about radiometric dating? And we have answers books that answer people's questions. This book is written explicitly for someone who isn't asking questions because they think Darwin answered them all in 1859. So it's written to raise questions and then answer them. So for anyone from a high school student who might be homeschooled but is trying to figure out what they actually believe, to even a hardcore evolutionist who who can't pay to pick up this book, written for them. And the way I've structured it, there's 3 parts to it. The first part, and the 2 goals I've been trying to accomplish throughout the entire text, cover to cover, is to create curiosity and establish credibility, to put a pebble in someone's shoe that they just can't shake and nagging and gnawing at them. And the way I've been thinking about this is, what would it take for me to pick up a book titled Replacing Jesus? I think it's a waste of time in 99 out of 100 cases. So what would it take for me to say, okay, fine, I probably should at least know what these people are saying? That's the philosophy I've applied in this book. So to create curiosity, part 1, and to establish credibility, part 1 is the history of genetics, where I try to show the reader instead of just telling them. I could have done part 1, the chapters 2 and 3 in a paragraph, but instead it's 2 chapters. To tell the history of genetics, number 1, to bring the reader up to speed if you know nothing about genetics, so that it's designed to be accessible, students in particular. But to show the reader, oh, this is all history I've heard in the classroom. Maybe this guy's in such a crackpot. But to show the reader that Darwin tried to answer a fundamentally genetic question long before anyone would have genetic answers with which to interrogate it. So he took a massive scientific risk. That's a point I think few people have made. That creates curiosity. Part 2 deals with the natural objection to that. Fine. You'll get evolutionists who will concede, yes, Darwin took a risk. Yes, Darwin knew 1% of what we know today. But they'll say it was the most important 1%. And he was able to convince his peers. Well, what has happened since 1859? And this is where I bring the reader up to speed on his arguments are largely irrelevant because they're designed to refute an antiquated, outdated view of creationism. We've become much better at understanding the implications of design. We freely invoke migration as an explanation for the geography of species. We're quite happy with new species forming within families. Part 2 says all that non-genetic stuff is back to square one. Part 3 is really the heart of the book, chapters 7 through 10. It is the replacing part of replacing Darwin instead of just the rebutting part, where we go through the implications of modern genetics. Some of the research I've done over the past 9 years, and actually a lot of it just comes from published evolutionary rates. I'll make a side comment here. If you go to the Amazon reviews, or just any sort of critical review of the book, they'll say, well, Nathaniel is making up his own mitochondrial DNA mutation rates. That's the first clue the person actually hasn't read the book, because those rates are not my rates, they're derived from published literature, secular literature. And what I show is in multiple independent lines of evidence, this is pointing towards a recent origin of species, limited origin of species, and I can predict the mutation rate, the fundamental mechanism of evolution. The young earth creationists can predict, and the evolutionists don't have an explanation. Anyway, that's the heart of the book, and I have yet to see someone really deal with it. Because so many evolutionists are unbelievers, the afterword has a gospel presentation. And endnotes, 30 pages of references. So the book is designed to be accessible and defensible. So it's designed for anyone to be able to read it. I had a pastor read through the text because I said I'm not looking to write for my nerdy PhD colleagues, so 0.2% of the world can understand it. It's designed for as many people to read it as possible because this information is so vital. But if you give it to a student and that student reads it, finds it interesting and goes to class and says, Professor, what do you think of this? That professor is going to lay into it. So that's what the 30 pages of references do. They defend against those sorts of attacks. If you try to put all that in the main text, it just bogs it down and makes it boring. So accessible and defensible. And we've got it for sale on the book table. We're doing, on all the books we have there, 20% off, whatever's the price on the back. It's designed to be a giveaway book. It's a book I wish I had when I was a student to hand to my unsafe classmates. And nothing makes my day more than hearing people purchase it and saying, I'm going to give it to so-and-so. A lady came up to me and said, I'm an administrative assistant at such and such university. My boss is the dean of biology. I'm buying it for him. I said, fantastic. He needs to read it. I don't make any money off of it. So obviously the book publisher gets his cut of the proceeds. The AIG cut of the proceeds goes into the research fund to fund future research in hopes that this will create a self-perpetuating cycle. I wrote it to be the research manual, hopefully, for the next 50 years. So proceeds help fund that. Now, what I hear from many people again, there's those who say you can't pay me to take your book. What you also find on the internet is plenty of people saying, if you Google it and you go to Reddit, a website, they'll say, has anyone read Jeanson's book? Because there's no way in blankety blank I'm going to pay any money to read it. Or give any money to Answers in Genesis. Well, you can get it off Amazon, hardcover and Kindle version. You can get the same formats in Barnes & Noble. You can get the ebook version from our website if you prefer to read that way. I've also set up a Facebook page by the title of the book, Replacing Darwin, for the purpose of having a safe space, so to speak. I've designed this as a means of communication for those who are reading it, especially those who are critical of it. Rumor has it that if you're at the university reads your email. So saying, email me is probably not going to work if you want to save your career. So get on Facebook, get your personal Facebook page, send me a message. That's the idea of this page. So send people to the Facebook page if they've got questions, if they've got criticisms. This story I told you tonight about Darwin's finches is obviously not in the book because it was a prediction that was fulfilled after the book was published. So you can find that article for free. You can share it on our, again, you just go to Answers in Genesis. In our search engine, just type bombshell replacing Darwin. It should pull up that and should pull up a second article that talks about how these species formed that is also consistent with what I was predicting last fall. I will be doing a debate with Herman Mays, the same evolutionary biologist I mentioned earlier, September 5th, on an atheist show, an online atheist show. So I just Skype in, so does he. They'll tape it and archive it. We also made them sign a contract to give us the rights to the video, so hopefully you can find it through us thereafter. So that's a Wednesday. We don't have a time yet set. If you haven't been to the Ark Encounter, I highly recommend it. I think people are shocked by two things. If you've been around the creation debate, it's not as much of a shock, but for the average person, the size of the boat, I think, is a dramatic shock, as well as the animals on board. There's sculptures of animals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars because they're made. You can't just get the hide of a modern species because that's not what was on board the Ark. That's the children's version of what was on board the Ark, the zebra and the giraffe and the elephant and so forth. Well, it's the kinds that were on board the Ark, the ancestors, and so you have to create those. And you'll see very high quality sculptures of those on board the Ark. Fantastic. And I'm surprised how many unbelievers. So at the NEA 2 years ago, when this first opened, we had a fairly hostile teacher come up to us. But this was being featured that year at our booth. And she said, of course, everyone's heard of Noah's Ark. Why wouldn't you want to go? Okay, well, that's not an aspect of American culture I was expecting. So even unbelievers, surveys show, and even my personal experience shows, they're intrigued by this. The textbook of our ministry is The Lie. I fortunately don't have it on the table, but we do have what I think is the ideal entry points for Christians who are unfamiliar with the debate and have all these questions. Answers books are written to answer those questions. Answers book 5, again, I don't have it on the table, but it was written to coincide with the opening of the Ark Encounter and focused on Ark and flood questions. We do have the DVDs of these books on the table. Again, 20% off. Don't have that, so I'll skip it. We do have a bi-monthly magazine, which is a way to stay up to speed what's going on. So as an example, when the book came out, they did an interview with me to sort of give the backstory of the book and tell the readership about the book. We've got bi-monthly news items talking about popular items that have occurred in the news and a biblical perspective on it if you teach Sunday school. So what I'd like to say is we're a parachurch ministry. The Bible does not ordain the parachurch ministry to do the work of ministry. It ordains the church, the local church, to do the work of ministry. And that's where the biggest battles are fought. It's rarely intimidating to feel the pressure from those out there, unbelievers, unless you're in science as a career. Much more challenging is the temptation in here, so to speak. People you rub shoulders with at church who say, well, why can't you have millions of viewers? Why can't you put evolution with the Bible? And that's a lot tougher when it comes from someone you love and someone you've known for umpteen years. So the work in the local church is the work of ministry. And we've created a Bible curriculum to aid the local church in teaching these truths. Answers book for kids we have, unfortunately not at the table. We have published at least one critical review of my book in Answers Research Journal. So again, if you know people who have a hot potato they just are sitting on and they gotta say something about it, well, we accept submissions of critical reviews, and I'll respond to them. We're actually on round 2 now of this PhD botanist from Denmark. You can find it on our website. I point out my review of his review of my book. So I guess soon I'll be publishing my response to his response to my response to his response to my book. That he basically avoids the 3 main points of the book and misrepresents the science and the strongest evidence. So I think that's telling. and speaks to the strength of the book. I'm going to stop there since I've run over time. We'll do a few announcements, take some questions, and then I'll be back at the table again, 20% off tonight for anything we have there.
Let's thank Nate.